are you doing today, sir? You doing all right?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I am absolutely thrilled because I love talking about Kafka. Well, maybe it'll be like Kafka-esque, right? Because there's an alarm going off and you can't focus and you can't claim it's like the system over you. It might be appropriate.
What would make it even more Kafka-esque too, as I was thinking, I was like, what if this was the time which a fire actually does go off, but nobody exits the building because they'll just think it's but the fire, for some reason, just nobody really noticed, and it just kind of went away. And so maybe there was a fire and just nobody will ever know about it.
That is hilarious. Wow, that really would be Kafka-esque. That really made my day. That's really funny. It goes off and it just goes.
Kafka and Dostoevsky were the two authors that wrote only fiction, but mainly influenced philosophers.
Yes,
primarily. I mean, of course, influenced many authors and countless of authors as well, but they're almost more known for their philosophy in the fiction than the actual fiction itself.
Well, because it's almost like the kind of philosophy they're trying to express can only be shown because it is so integrated into the very psyche of the people.
That existentialism in general, especially dealing with metaphysical kind of an ontology, is just so perfect for fiction. It's almost better expressed in fiction than it would be an essay. It's just because that deals with being, and we're more inclined to relate to being to something in which we can actually understand than just reading it in any kind of essay form.
Well, what you're saying, I think, cannot be overstated. I think that was very well put, because what existentialism is exploring, or how Kafka is exploring the very nature of desire, the psyche, the mind, to create the very situation that it is trapped within, kind of as a feedback loop. It is much better shown than explained. Because when I explain it, you can always, here's kind of the thing, when a philosophical argument, you can always exempt yourself from, because it's kind of like, it's kind of abstract. But a story, well, you can be in a story. You can end up like this if you can relate to it. So an urgency is also brought forward when you have the philosophical argument in the form of a story. And I think both Dostoevsky and Mr. Kafka, who are my two favorite, funny enough, actually
only two fiction authors on these shelves here is those two.
Well, because they are indeed showing a philosophical argument that, to be told, would have to leave a lot out. But of course, the dilemma is that when you show it, people could miss it because they may not interpret it correctly. Right. I mean, all of the different kind of moves that they're making, but it's kind of, the map isn't the territory. So you have to take risk of missing out of some level of incompleteness somewhere. And they went on the side of it being lost because people do not interpret it correctly. But of course, if it wasn't written as such in the form of a story, it wouldn't be there to interpret at all. So it's a necessary risk. Because it's also the dilemma that ideas are not experiences, and we don't tend to learn from ideas, we tend to learn from experiences, and literature is closer to experiences. And so there's something where you can more connect it to it, and also therefore they're more connected to the lived. And a lot of existentialism, the arguments of existentialism are really fully understood in the context of the lived. And so you need to be as close to it as possible.
Absolutely. And reading something like Being and Nothingness, I start introducing so many stories to get his point across. Like, where's Pierre? He's now in a store, or through the keyhole, or there's so many little tiny stories after he's done explaining what he's trying to say. Then he's like, gives an actual example as kind of a story, more story format.
Oh, and to that point, what are a lot of philosophers like to take pride and be like, metaphors are bad. We just want those kind of a priori arguments or whatever. Well, what happens to be the ideas that people remember most? The ones that involve a metaphor or a story, that's the ones they just happen to be most attracted to.
I think the philosophers, they just want to be on Plato's side, or one of these. That's all. They're just like, yeah, of course he was right. It's Plato.
Well, it actually brings to mind what you were saying, what you said on bias. You're very kind to always listen to and comment on all these different videos. That's so kind of you to do that.
It's always something to say.
Well, you're very kind. And what you said on bias, where we like to assume that bias equals error and that being so erroneous, I think there's something similar. We as like philosophers like to assume that the presence of literature, or metaphor, or image means that it's not right, but it's a similar sort of illogic. There is no reason to assume that just because a metaphor is used, that therefore it is less philosophically important than if you just use some symbolic logic or something that you find in Quinn.
Yeah, and you bring up a very good point. And actually, this, I mean, as soon as you said this, I was thinking of the Hunger Artist in that video on objectivity, and when you say why would we assume that being objective is closer to any truth than being subjective? And it is a weird thing that we've just always assumed.
We just do
it. And making a person object doesn't necessarily see this in the Hunger Artist with where he literally is the art, and where unlike entertainment, that where an object might give entertainment, art is within the thing itself.
Absolutely.
And so when that thing itself is the person, like in the Hunger Artist, that's exactly what they do, is they turn him into the object. He is now he's not the artist creating art, he is the art.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one of the great ironies is, in the same way that humans can only be animal-like, they can't be animals. We can only be object-like. We can't be objects, because even though he becomes objectified, he struggles to get people to believe him that he's actually doing his fast, that he's not cheating. But there's something about being an object that is what he wants, but simultaneously not entirely what he wants. It's quite curious, the kind of motivations and desires really of the Hunger Artist. Interesting to ask the question, what does the Hunger Artist hunger for? Like, what does he want? Which is so strange, because you have some parts where he wants fame, he wants to be admired, but then there are other things where it's like, well, only he can know his record, like no one else can know. And so there's these weird, contradictory, paradoxical desires that he has.
This is right before we started this. This is what I was thinking, and I was trying to answer that exact question, and I thought two possible answers. That one could very well deal with authenticity, and it's just and not that fact of living in bad faith, because but at the same, and especially in a position of the Hunger Artist, is how long do you pretend to be the Hunger Artist until you actually are? Because you couldn't start being a Hunger Artist at any given time. It's something that slowly happens, and at what point are you actually that?
Exactly.
And if it's a case of authenticity, then where he is on the spectrum to where he's becoming a Hunger Artist, at what point does he stop playing the Hunger Artist and actually just is? And so him, when they put the banquet out and he doesn't take anything, that's for him. That is what he's taking from the banquet, because that is what because anything else, then it's almost he goes back a little bit and has to pretend a little longer. And it's there's another thought that I had to that, and it'll come to me.
Well, I just want to, there's something interesting where, to your point, it's almost as if to the Hunger Artist, and for anyone listening to this, I'll also stress the Hunger Artist is one of those pieces that you read, and there's so much going on with. This is the brilliance of Kafka. There's so much going on in this one piece that you're like, what? That you have to examine.
Even another layer, though, is there's so much going on that you want to interpret every little thing, but so much of Kafka at the same time is not really supposed to be, it is just actually what it is. And it's like at what point are you what is it you're supposed to be or if anything, is it even left open, in which it's up to the reader to decide, or did he literally just write everything? He woke up one day and he just was a bug. It's like, what does that mean? It means that he woke up one day and he was a bug. That's it.
But I'm so glad you brought this up. You know, a few things. One, Kafka shows you that if you're actually going to be more full, there's going to be more going in your story. There's a lot more to think about and interesting when you just try to tell the story. You know, writers that go in trying to make something kind of, you know, that can be interpreted and has many different meanings and is ambiguous, that can kind of fail. But when you just try to tell a story about a hunger artist, and as you talked about in your video, that was so good, it was actually based on a particular, I had no idea. That was fascinating.
Yeah, actually, I didn't know that either until I started doing some research on the history of it, and I found that out. Oh yeah, and back on that point you left off, on how it can mean so much more if you just tell the story. Yep. Then it goes back to how people relate to this, because people do this in real life. Something will happen to them in a day that might be a bit coincidental or something, and immediately they're trying to attach meaning to it, or like something that wasn't actually there, and then they'll start talking about fate and all this, and really no, that's just how it happened.
Wife and I just had a conversation. We talked about the meaning crisis. You have this idea, the meaning crisis. And one of the things we talk about is that although human beings need meaning, there's actually a problem where we can find meaning and say everything our spouse does or everything our friends do. Like, for example, they forget to pick up the shampoo at the store. So it means that they're irresponsible. And we ask her why they're irresponsible. And so like finding meaning too much can actually destroy your life and actually cause problems. And you see this happen in relationships a lot, where you take the impulse for meaning too far and then you're just mean, is the whole idea of the meaning crisis. And you know, one of the funny things is when you talk about interpretation, you know, like, I'm just, Kafka's unbelievable. And it was funny because as I was thinking about the hunger artist, I picked up the trial and was going through, and I entirely forgot that after that section where Joseph K meets the chaplain, you know, he does the story of the law, and he's like the gate and it's just for you, and he closes it. I forgot that after that, they have a long discussion of the interpretation of what the law means. And what I found so fascinating is that the chaplain was able to successfully argue that the guard who doesn't let the guy in, maybe he's the victim here. Maybe he's actually the one serving the man because he has to stay there keeping the guard, where the guy who sits down in front of the gate and he can leave whenever he wants, he's free, but the guard isn't free. And so what Kafka does is he shows how interpretation can be used to make the guy that gets old sitting in front of the gate waiting to be allowed into the law, where somehow he becomes the guy with all the power, and so for me, what was so interesting is that shows how interpretation can be used to actually serve power or to serve those controlling people. Because you're like, well, wait a minute, maybe I don't know what they're actually intending. So maybe they're not in the wrong. In the same way that like throughout the trial, like when Joseph K goes to the lawyer to tell the lawyer, I'm going to get rid of you, suddenly, and you know, because you've done such a bad job, suddenly somehow the lawyer becomes the victim in all this. Like every time it's everyone else is the victim. And that contributes to Joseph K not being so sure if he's in the right, which then contributes to him continuing to participate in the process that incriminates him and eventually leads to his execution. And so actually what I find so interesting is there's something in Kafka, I think maybe one of the reasons why we have to assume that it's not always interpretation is because Kafka has actually seen how the mechanism is actually aware of how the mechanism of meaning and interpretation can contribute to being imprisoned or end up walking towards your own execution. That to me, and to bring it back to the hunger artist, what's so fascinating to me in Kafka is it's exactly how the mind understands the world, how desire operates, how we organize ourselves in the world that contributes to our entrapment, that contributes to the problem. Whereas in, say, Orwell and Huxley, it's some sort of top-down, Orwell, you're being forced into following the state, or in Huxley, it's your pleasure that's being driven. In Kafka, there's a far more interesting mechanism of how the mind operates and is stuck in interpretation and is stuck in desire that contributes to the capture.
So much of his work could be seen as a metaphor for that everyone's trapped.
Yes,
you have Joseph K, who's being persecuted for the unknown crime, and then you have of course Gregor Samsa. He stays in his room. You have the hunger artist who's in his cage, and then you have K from the castle, who no matter how close he gets to the castle, he gets further away, and so he seems to be trapped in this very kind of close. It's very claustrophobic in all of his work. I just realized I didn't really think that until you were saying that.
Well, what's so crazy is, to me, I guess when I was reading The Hunger Artist again, it kind of struck me. I was like, what do Kafka characters want? Like, so what does the hunger artist hunger for? And you say, well, Daniel, it's obvious. I mean, the dude in Metamorphosis doesn't want to be a bug. The dude in the hunger artist, he wants to be admired. It's like, well, hold on. Actually, what's so interesting about the Metamorphosis is that he wants to pay for his parents' debt. He wants to get back to work. He doesn't like the fact that he's a bug is almost secondary to the fact that he's kind of captured trying to get back to work. And in fact, the irony there is precisely why he's been, metaphorically at least, the reason he's been reduced to a bug is because of his job. And yet he wants to not be a bug to go back to his job.
It's the first thing he does when he wakes up is tries to call his boss.
What was interesting to me on The Hunger Artist is when we ask the question, what does he want? Yes, it seems like he wants to be admired, but then he also wants to break the 40-day restriction, right? He wants to set his own record. But he knows that if he goes beyond 40 days, no one's going to care. The whole reason they set the restriction at 40 days is because the public loses interest after 40 days. So wait a minute, there's something very contradictory here. Why would he want to go beyond 40 days to be admired, like he says, which then we have to examine what does he mean by this, if he knows that going beyond the 40 days means he won't be admired? There's some sort of negation here.
Exactly to my point. That's what it is. It's actually not so much what his characters want. It's what his characters don't want. It's also as if they're all trying to get rid of something.
Yes.
Or something that was put on them by circumstances in which they're completely unaware of. And Joseph K., Gregor Samsa, none of this is, it's the negation of everything that we look at it as what do they want? But it's actually whatever is not there. And
I think what you're getting at is precisely why Kafka is so fascinating, because he is examining the way that want and what we do not want all work to create certain existential pressures that we want to escape, which becomes a new want that then meets another negation, and you're operating within this. And then as you are psychologically so operating, you become very susceptible to capture, whether it be the capture of the society, the capture of the state, because you are not psychologically in a state to even notice that is occurring or to realize that you are participating in it. It's like that extraordinary part at the end of the trial where, when the two guys are taking him to his execution and the police officer comes up and he literally helps the executioners escape from the police. Like he runs, he's like, oh gosh, we got to get away.
That's right. Oh man, I got it.
And he's like participating in his own execution. And then at the end of it, he feels bad because he doesn't take the knife and stab himself. Like as they're handing it between one, so he knows that he didn't commit this crime. He knows that he's not guilty at it. And then at the end, he feels bad because he's not able to execute himself for this crime that he knows he did not commit. It's extraordinary internalization.
Yes, it's almost a feeling of remorse that comes along with just complete exhaustion. And again with the metamorphosis, it's the same thing. It's just you can only do it so much, and in the end, it's out like a dog, and that's it.
I think the word exhaustion you said is also so big for Kafka because what is the modern world defined by? You have, Barthes talking about the literature of exhaustion. You have this existential weight.
Yes.
There's this feeling of tiredness because we're just tired of thinking. We're tired of thinking if, fascism's going to take it. We're tired of thinking if the vaccines are going to, we're tired of thinking if Trump's going to get, there's this like thinking in pluralism because everything's destabilized. And there's this kind of exhaustion that starts to set in. And the trial is absolutely defined by characters being exhausted, and in that exhaustion being captured or just wanting to get through. And there's something also where Kafka is suggesting that one of the ways we are quote unquote captured is precisely because we are exhausted by this dance between wants and a lack of wants that exists in a society that is simultaneously keeping from those wants but giving us the ideas of wants. And you don't see that exhaustion. I guess I bring up Orwell and Huxley because everyone is always talking about this too, but I think Kafka is the one who's actually kind of showing how it goes because what you see there is in Orwell and Huxley, exhaustion is not a mechanism of putting people in a psychological state where they are captured by their own desires, by their own will and mechanisms of participation. And that's what you see in Kafka that seems much more real and seems to be more so of what defines modernity. And then you start to see like fasting. There's an exhaustion in fasting that kind of takes place. And there's just this kind of weighingness that characterizes Kafka throughout.
Yeah. And that's actually, I'm going through all his work. It's hard to find one that doesn't exemplify that, especially with the castle, and that it's not just exhaustion, but if you don't, it would be interesting if we had a complete ending of the castle, because how would something like that end? He's just that exhaustion of just, it doesn't end. In fact, the more you contribute to it, the larger it gets, or the further away you get from it, and so it's not just the more exhausted you are, it's that if you even continue, there's just going to be even more of it left. And the more you continue, then you're going to be, and I can't think of anything in which something in which that could be applied that he wrote.
Oh, and it's interesting because I also, Kafka is also one of those writers where you kind of forget some of the stories he does. Like, for example, I stumbled upon Investigations of a Dog, and I had completely forgotten about that story. And I read it and I was like, I feel like all the secrets of Kafka are somehow packed in the story. Like there's something really deep here. And one of the exhaustions of that is the fact of trying to figure out the meaning of this vision of dancing dogs on their hind legs. And he goes in these scientific experiments, and there's an exhaustion of like trying to find absolute truth. So you have this kind of exhaustion of finding the meaning of these kind of divine revelations. You have the exhaustion of getting to the castle, or getting to the center of the bureaucracy, if you will, to figure. You have the exhaustion of trying to figure out the law, which is hilarious because throughout the trial, nobody seems to have read the law, and yet people can tell you about it. There's this exhaustion of dealing. There's this exhaustion of trying to get out of the situation of being a bug so that you can get to work, which has exhausted you, and you're always talking about. The funny thing in the Metamorphosis that's so interesting is the only time freaking Greg he gets a day off is when he turns into a bug. And then and he spends the whole time trying to not be a bug so that he can go back to work. And so that's also suggesting the mechanisms of exhaustion that you want to escape then habituate you to want to re-participate in those mechanisms of exhaustion. So then it's a complete form of capture, where therefore your psychology, your very mind, is part of the mechanism of capture. And I keep saying capture, and I'm kind of thinking Deleuze. Whereas in say, you see the problem, I guess, with an Orwell and a Huxley, if we're just using those as reference points, is that the protagonists often are aware of the capture, and they're like trying to fight it, and they're like very opposed to it. Even at the end, if they love Big Brother because of the torture or whatever, we know that they kind of stand in opposition to the form of control. Whereas in Kafka, the mechanisms of control are more integrated into the very psyche and minds of the people and in their very desires, which seems to be actually more true to life. That seems to be actually what we as human beings can do. That's the function of, say, ideology, if you will, in Zizek or different things, where we participate in these things and not even know it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I can't think of anything.
Yeah, I just threw the ball at you. I'm like, I just threw it at you. I'm like, oh.
I'm like, is there anything else to add to that specific point? Not really. I think that at least on that point, that pretty much summed that up pretty well.
Well, and then I guess this idea of like participating in ideology can then bring us back to the Hunger Artist, because there's something for me that's so important for Kafka, and we talked about it, is the difference between animal and animal-like. Like the only way to escape the mechanisms of the capture of thinking itself is to not think, is to be an animal. But what we see in the Hunger Artist, as we'll explore, is that it would seem that the best human beings can do is to be animal-like, but they cannot become an animal. And Deleuze, when I think Deleuze is at his best when he talks about literature, like he has a piece on Proust, and he talks about Kafka and different, and he brought up the fact that in the role of animals in Kafka, and like we talked about the Metamorphosis, for example. A lot of people say he's like a roach or a cockroach or whatever. He's actually not. He's more like an insect-like creature.
Well, the German word for it is actually best translated as vermin.
Interesting.
Which is I don't know where I have my German copy, but yeah, it's something best interpreted as vermin. But it is strange because when he describes them, it does sound like he's describing a cockroach,
like some kind of roach
or something. But at the same time, there's at no point in the story where he flies.
That's right.
When he very well could have, if he was that kind of instance. So yeah, there really is actually no telling what he is.
Yeah, that's correct. There's kind of this ambiguity there that sort of exists, where you have something that's insect, but he's more insect-like, not quite giving you that confirmation. And even when you have like the investigations of a dog, dogs don't talk. You know, and the whole idea also in investigations of a dog is that the dog is driven by a desire to understand this vision that he saw of these singing dogs when he's young and he's trying to understand it. So even though he's in an animal's body, he does not have an animal consciousness. He's only like an animal because his mind is still driven by the human structuring. And what's interesting to me, I guess I bring this up because if we go to this question of what does the hunger artist want, dang it, you know, what does he want? So if he knows that, I can't help but think he really wants people to believe that he's for real, right? And it's almost like if he can get past the 40-day mark, then people will, because at the beginning of the story, what I find very interesting is he like tells people fasting is easy. This isn't a revelation at the end of the book. He makes no secret of it, which is strange because if fasting, because then there's a weird double action. If in fact he were to go beyond the 40-day mark, that would seemingly prove, it's almost like he wants to therefore do that to prove that fasting is easy for him. But if he does that, will that not undermine his accomplishment? Will that not kind of make his accomplishment not matter? So why would he want to do that?
I was looking at that line last night, and I says, yeah, he alone knew what no other initiate knew, how easy it was to fast. It was the easiest thing in the world. He did not conceal this, but no one believed him. And I always just simply took that as just kind of how kind of like the Bukowski line in "Don't Try." You know, it is easy to. He actually he can't help but do it. It's so easy that he doesn't have to do anything. And it's just, and as such is the artist in general. You know, it's you know, I can sketch or something, and someone will ask me, like, well, how do you do it? And it's like, well, yeah, I don't know, I just follow the line. It's easy.
Yeah.
No, but everyone will tell me like, what you're doing is not easy. I'm like, well, I don't know how to explain it. It's easy. And so it's that's how I always just took that one, because he does say that nobody believed him that it was easy.
Yep.
And every artist will hear that when people tell us, they'll try and say, well, it's easy. You know, I mean, not all artists would say, I mean, of course there's you know, it's not actually easy. There's hours and hours and hours of practice, but it is still, even these hours and hours of practice come out. It's something the artist wants to do or has no choice but to do. And like when Husserl was asked, you know, why do you philosophize? He says, I just don't know what else to do. You know, it's like it's just, that's what I do. You know, it's not so much an occupation as it is just me. It's more than just a characteristic of my being. It's like your being is a characteristic of the artist and or the art itself.
No, so that's outstanding. Because it, you know, as a little note, it would seem that also it's kind of similar to this idea of characters participating in the very ideology or system that oppresses them. You know, how do you do it? Well, it's the easiest thing in the world because it structures your thinking. You just find yourself doing it. But it would not seem that every single person that's doing what is the easiest thing in the world to them is the same. You know, there are different kinds, and he's exploring these. It's almost like for that dog in Investigations of a Dog, once he has that vision of all the dogs in his standing up, it's the easiest thing in the world to devote his entire life to solving that question. He can't help it. You know, once Joseph K. is accused of a crime he's not guilty of, it's the easiest thing in the world to just try to find the law. You can't do any, it structures your entire being in that way. And it's almost like it's almost like Kafka is suggesting that we have two choices, you know, generally, it's always dangerous to say two choices too, you know, whatever. But you either, as an artist, do the easiest thing in the world where it's kind of you over you in a way and you follow it, or you're still going to do something that's easy in the world, but it's going to be external to you, some sort of system is going to be controlled. So you either almost get controlled by this inner drive, or you're going to get controlled by this outer drive. And there's like these two kind of differences here.
It's because the artist by nature is someone that typically will decline a more conventional the system or a shared ideology, and will typically go against that just because that's what an artist does. And in every case, I mean, it's from something as the hunger artist to doing something that typically, you know, no one would do on purpose. It's due to, well, yeah, anything. The art itself is something that stands in contrast to the reality that stands around, but still stands as something maybe representative of it, holding up a mirror to it. But still, the artists themselves to do so has to go again, and it's this not only this easy way of not participating in a society that demands it to survive, but they do it anyway. And so it's the ideology is bent around that.
Well, what's interesting is one of the reasons why Kafka shows that he's such a great writer is because, you know, he's a writer, he's an artist, and it would therefore be expected that he would suggest art is the solution to this problem of, say, capture by Joseph K. But right here in The Hunger Artist, he might be saying, I don't know, guys, you might not be that better off. You know, Kafka wants to make very clear that we're all, quote unquote, captured by something. And the very thing that we seem to be captured by is our own, say, desire for justice, desire for the truth, desire to be acknowledged, of which then has to be conditioned by the social order. And then there's this weird kind of playing back and forth. And even if we want to transcend the social order, we may tend to do it in a manner that is still in honor of the social order without realizing it. Yes. And there's all these kind of complexities that you have to deal with. And so one of the reasons you can say that, you know, Kafka is a great writer is because he does not put his own profession and his own work above the problem that he is outlining in all of these different situations, where in the same way that, you know, someone like a Joseph K is captured, if I keep using that language, in the law, the hunger artist could be captured by this art within him to bring himself to a place where he dies. And very often you can kind of get some writers that can suggest, oh, if everyone was just an artist, we'd all be better off, everything would work. And I do think there's truth to that. Obviously, I'm biased, but Kafka is so brilliant because he doesn't make it so simple. He wants to suggest the possibility that maybe there could be a problem here, which again just brings us to the question, what is the hunger artist hungry for? Because it's so curious to me that it's almost like, I guess I couldn't help as I was reading it to think, so the hunger artist also is really upset if like people doubt him. Like those guards at night, right? Where they just go off and play cards and assume he's eating, and he gets so mad and he's like singing to show that he's not eating anything. He really prefers the people who are like holding the bars, watching him every second, that has his eye to see that he's not cheating. Because it's almost like he wants to be seen, he wants to be acknowledged, and to know that he's not cheating the fast, almost precisely so that it can get to the point where people know and don't doubt that it's easy for him, which would be for people to know that what he does is not worthy of admiration, because he just does it easily. And yet he says he wants to be admired. So the question becomes, how do those things kind of go together? In what way do you want to be admired if you want to be watched so closely that it eventually will just get to the place where people like can't doubt that it's easy for you because you can just do it? In what way do they want to admire? Well, this is what's interesting to me. The only creatures, what is admired in the story? Animals. Animals are admired. People are at a zoo. They go and see anthers, and this is the mysterious panther that shows up at the end, right? The panther is just there, and people just can't take their eyes off it. There's no guards going off and playing cards when the panther shows up in the cage. Everyone is just admiring the panther. The panther doesn't have to suffer, though. It's just itself. What is a panther? The animal is just itself. It doesn't have to starve. It doesn't even have to consciously perform. It just is. There's a kind of radical isness to the panther, right? And there's a kind of radical isness to all the animals. It's almost as if the hunger artist also wants to participate in that radical isness and just be like, look, I can't help but be a creature that doesn't want to eat everything. I am compelled by an isness. Admire me in that isness, which is such a strange kind of thing that's being pointed to.
It really does show this contrast between entertainment and art. You know, it's entertainment simply is by being entertaining, so long as there's a spectator to judge it as such.
Yes.
Whereas art is going to be art whether anyone sees it or not. It still is what it is. But entertainment is something that is projected onto the object, whereas the art is something that is internally given, whether it's received or not, unlike entertainment.
Absolutely. And there's something also too in the hunger artist where he's very concerned what people think. And there's, you know, what people think about what he's doing. And one of the great tortures, if you will, of the human experience is not being able to know what other people are thinking, or to know what they're thinking that you're thinking, or to know what they think that you're thinking, and so on and so forth, this kind of meta mentality. But in order to have certainty, you know, to really, it seems like something in Kafka that's important is a feeling of knowing that you know. There's like two levels. You can get the truth, but not know you have the truth. So it doesn't matter if you have the truth. Like, because right here, the hunger artist knows that he's breaking these records. He knows that it's doing, but he doesn't know that other people know that he is breaking those records. And there's a kind of torture there. He is a truth in a way. He is like, there's that really funny part where the dad is telling his kid, hey, you know, I've seen greater performances. Is that when I was younger, there were other hunger artists and they were better, you know, at the end of the story or whatever. Wait a minute. This hunger artist is literally the world record. He has to be. And the dad is standing there telling his kids about greater performances in the past, when this guy is literally beating the record. He has to be, which goes to show that just because you're beholding the best of the best doesn't mean you know you're beholding the best of the best. And there's nothing that the hunger artist can do to force people to know that he's legit. But maybe this is a thought I had. You know, I was talking earlier how he wants to negate himself. It's almost like in the act of negation that there's a like, oh, well, this isn't like people would scorn him. It's funny how human beings trust when people insult us. Like if someone says, you know, if people like, Daniel, I really like your book, you're like, yay. But then when somebody says, I hate your book, you really believe that person. Like you only believe the person that like dislikes your stuff. And there's something about where when you get scorn, you get certainty, but then you're not getting admiration. Right. So and when you get admiration, you don't feel like it's admiration. And so it doesn't really feel like admiration. So there's this thing where you want to be certain of the admiration you get, but you cannot do that. It never happens. And you can't, even if you are legit and literally setting the world record, you may have a dad out there telling his kids about greater performances in the past. So then you just get this feeling where the hunger artist is ultimately, it's like he just wants to be an animal. He just wants to be because thinking about this is it's just, you can't win. You cannot win because where there's certainty, there's scorn, and where there's admiration, there is not certainty. So it doesn't feel like admiration. And so you're always trapped in this problem. But if you were just an animal, you wouldn't have to worry about it. You could just be in the cage and not even miss your freedom, as the panther is. But the best that the human can ever be is animal-like. They can never be animal. And so they can never achieve that sort of freedom. All they can do is approach it, which is almost worse because then you're like, you know, being treated like an animal. You're animal-like. And the hunger artist is in this cage and all that. He's like an animal, but he's not able to get the same admiration and free of the wondering of what people are thinking like the panther is.
I was reminded of, or how that could be looking at the Kierkegaardian problem of either or. He's not either or. It still says the hunger has found a way to be the one that stands in the middle and doesn't make it's you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. But what if you're right in the middle to the point where you metaphorically starve to death?
That's right.
Then are you still in that position? I don't know.
I think that's brilliant. I think bringing in Kierkegaard here, because I do believe Kafka had read Kierkegaard. I think there is something to the either or where I think so many of Kafka's characters actually are in the either or. And it's like it's like trying to be the slash mark between the either and the or.
Yes,
that's the answer. But it would seem that we can't. Like, in order to be that, or to at least dissolve the problem, you would have to be an animal, but you can't do that. All you can be is animal-like. And so you're stuck in this either or, where where it's you're either starving to death or you're being admired, and you can't know you're being admired. So just turn off your brain. But if you turn off your brain, you can't know you're admired either. And so you're kind of trapped.
The irony too of it all is this: is if you take the Aristotelian kind of a line, the human being is the rational animal. That might be true, except in this situation, it's the rational animal doing everything it possibly can do to be irrational.
That's right.
And so is he more now animal? Right. Simply by being completely irrational.
Well, again, what's so fascinating is, I think what you're getting at with rationality is very important, because rationality, as Kafka has explored, becomes a kind of mechanism of control. Like, is it not rational if you're accused of a crime that you're not guilty of, to try to figure out, why, to prove your innocence? But all throughout the trial, characters are like, well, you've done it now, now that you've said this. And at the beginning, they're like, couldn't you have just stayed in your room? It's very possible that if Joseph K. just stayed in his room, everything would have been fine. But he had to ring that bell, and he had to come out and look into matters, which was rational. It was very, very rational to do that. But because he does that, he makes everyone mad.
And it's very rational. Due to the very first sentence, you're told exactly right off the bat that he is in fact innocent.
That's right.
Someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K. Because for no reason at all, he was arrested one morning. And your point that fits in perfectly with how this started, with rationality being this sense of control. Well, if it can't, how far can this rationality be a sense of control when what is that's guiding this rationality, or set this off to begin with, is actually the thing that's controlling you?
Yes.
Without you even realizing.
Yes.
So how rational can you possibly be in such a situation?
Well, and that's the issue, is that once you step into the situation, even if the situation itself is bad, you're now operating within a rationality where you can't even see that the situation is bad, because you are captured in it. It frames rationality in a manner that serves the problem and makes it worse and worse. And that's the mechanism of control that Kafka explores so often in his works, that is not seen in, say, an Orwell or Huxley, or is understood enough, that really shows how everyone is this and together throughout the trial. Throughout the trial, Kafka explains that basically the lawyers and the judges are all trapped in this too. It's not just Joseph K. Like, everyone is in this sort of trap. And the trap seems to be a rationality in a way. Well, let's put it this way. This isn't to say rationality is bad, but the key is that rationality is always organized relative to an idea of what we think is true. Like, the rationality is organized with the truth. And if we pick the wrong truth, well, then rationality can be organized in a very destructive way. But here's the problem. Well, how else do we pick our truth other than by rationality, right? So there's a chicken and egg problem, right? Yes, so you need rationality to pick a truth, but whatever truth you pick will then structure a rationality, and that can lead into a very mechanism of capture that thinking itself causes by the nature of thinking. Like,
it's kind of what would happen if one again that's how the way one judges rationality is. Then in doing so, the situation itself becomes irrational, and vice versa. If the situation then is rational, then you become irrational. That's right. Just based off of that alone. So I guess I'm just kind of rewording what you said with the chicken and the egg thing. It's like, I guess. I'm just kind of rewording.
Well, no, it's so critical, because then if you think the world would be a better place if everyone was rational, well, it would depend on what truth everyone was rational relative to. And unfortunately, it may just be that truth may just simply be a reflection of the state, It might be a reflection of the zeitgeist. It might be a reflection of popularity. Say with the hunger artist, it might be a reflection of, say, some strange vision that a dog had when he was a pup, where he said a bunch of dogs singing and standing on their hind legs. That experience organizes what is rational for that dog to do for the rest of his life, to the point where he's doing these kind of crazy science experiments and different things like that. And so that's the, Kafka is begging you to kind of ask the question, what is the truth that you are organizing your rationality to? Because if you've never asked that, then you're going to be operating within it in a manner that may contribute to, helping your executioners escape the police so that they can kill you at the end.
It is really that is what is then represented as that absurdism. And
yes.
I don't know if you ever read Camus' essay on Kafka, that you can very much see, because of these almost attempts at almost organization of the mind, to mirror what your environment may be. Because of these attempts, it ends up doing the reverse.
Well, we mentioned at the beginning how both Dostoevsky and Kafka are sort of at this ultra-human level of thinking and writing, and how both of them are interested in philosophical investigations that are best shown versus told, and how like the kind of way that they're arguing is through the story, because it's with the existential and the personal, and that's better shown. Well, a very similar thing to Kafka is Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov, because, Ivan, earlier in the Brothers Karamazov, tells us that, everyone attributes that line, if God didn't exist, everything would be permitted. They attribute it to Alyosha, but actually it originally comes from Ivan at the beginning of the book, where he says something like, if there was no eternal, there would be no kind of set finite value.
Yes, that's right. Right.
And so, but what's so funny is, wait a minute, Ivan's the one who says, God shouldn't have given us free will because because of the children that get killed in the Grand Inquisitor section, all that stuff. Wait a minute, Ivan, hold up, man. The whole reason you would think it was wrong for the children to die is because there exists a God who you are saying messed up, which, by the way, how can you say God messed up unless you're God, because God knows everything? And so so Ivan's very critique against God would then require there to be a God to make that critique. And that's why Ivan throughout the book is like basically on a fence the entire way and gradually goes insane. Yeah, and it's like the Brothers Karamazov was supposed to be like book 1 of 7 called The Great Sinner. It's probably going to follow Ivan Karamazov. But what Dostoevsky is showing is how ideas themselves, it is rational to critique God for giving man free will because of the happening, the suffering of children. But that very truth requires there to be a God, according to Ivan's logic, to provide it. So the rationality that Ivan is following leads to a questioning of the very truth that rationality needs to be itself. So there's a kind of negative principle in the same way that Kafka is often operating in these negative principles. And what's so strange is that in that space of total negate of this kind of opening where there's no map that can help you figure out this territory. Like you just have to make a raw choice, a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. I think the end of the investigation of a dog is this kind of freedom. It's all about freedom, right? And it's like this desire for freedom, but freedom is terrifying. But you know what would be great? The freedom of an animal, because an animal can just be free and they don't have to think about that freedom. They can just do and they can just act and they don't have to think about it. But alas, all human beings can be is animal-like. They cannot be animal. So then what do we do with that?
Usually that freedom ends up being terrifying, and then I can hear Sartre, we're all condemned to be free, and it's like yes, that's people just take this as something that's such a positive, where freedom's always a good thing, right? It always has positive connotation, and it's like, well, wait a minute, No, because if that's the case and you are absolutely free, then the consequences of that, not that necessarily, but the consequences that can arise from that, you have to be careful with every little thing you do.
That's right.
And very conscious of it. Because if you're not, then you're not an animal. You're guilty.
Like I said, I'm running through all of Kafka instead of just the hunger artist. I can't help myself. I get so excited.
No, this is the best way to talk about Kafka.
It's so tremendous to have someone who is so well read in Kafka to really understand, because I do think he is utterly critical for understanding how the human psyche works, how things operate, and so on and so forth. Because it's just like you're saying on freedom. Like once the hunger artist He's free. He can be,
Yes,
he can fast all he wants. And yet he's unhappy. There's a kind of like, it's not what he wants, even though it seems to be what he wants, because he seems to want escape from wondering what people think, wondering that people doubt him. And it's kind of, that's where at the end, where he's like, he tells a person, oh, I want to be admired. And they say, oh, we do admire you. And then he's like, and you shouldn't admire me. Well, we don't admire you, which is hilarious. But there's this kind of like, people aren't thinking, they're just saying what he wants to hear. And he wants to be free of that. He wants to be free of even it made me think when I keep saying that, like he wants to be an animal, not just animal-like. There's a sense in which humans want to be free of freedom, where we don't just want to be free, but like free of the idea of freedom and the responsibility of freedom, like free from freedom entirely.
Yes, the only thing we can't be free from, if we have absolute freedom, that is the only thing in which it's he does choose to stay in the cage. I mean, he can leave whenever he wishes, but he chooses because for the exact reason you're saying. It's you leave metaphorically, if anyone could choose to be free, or we would sit there in shaking in an open cage. We wouldn't want to be free. That's right. We just it's that it's because this is exactly the panther where he talks about the panther doesn't he had a freedom in the cage. He talks about when he's caged, he's aware of his freedom, and he's comfortable. He knows he's going to get food. He knows he has no need to he has no idea why people are even watching him to begin with. There's no conceptual connection there. So but that freedom's still there.
That's right.
Without the need of that gaze.
Well, that's 100%. Where you see there, the hunger artist is looking for that kind of quote unquote freedom from freedom that the panther has, because he's kind of unaware, of the fact that he's receiving his food. He's just kind of in a flow. It's almost like the panther in a way is kind of, they talk about flow, where you're kind of not thinking about time. You're just kind of lost. There's something about the animal that, although not identical with flow, there's something about the lack of the human mind in the animal or the psyche or whatever that makes them in this kind of flow state where they're free from the idea of freedom because they're just being. There's kind of a raw being there, which funny enough is kind of godlike. And I can't help but every time I read like the investigation of the dog or like a dog, like that's why at the end of the trial when he's like a dog, it's so painful because he's like a dog, but he's not a dog. Where a dog like a dog. And dog, of course, if you reverse it, is God, God, God and dog. You reverse it in different things.
I've always been curious on why Joseph K. said that, and I've gone back and read this over and over and over again. I always relate to this you work like a dog. That people would compare their work like dogs over, and people make that comparison, except that doesn't really fit with the trial.
No,
it's I don't know why. I've never found a way.
I could not help, first off, I could not help when reading the part like a dog, one, to think of like a dog, like an animal, but not an animal. And therefore, when he's like a dog, he has a consciousness that can participate in the situation that has him be in the trial. And at the end, all he is like an animal. He's which is the worst of all possible worlds, because you're like an animal, but you don't even get the freedom that an animal has, and that you end up executed. And I also can't help but read that line and think, I've mentioned it a bunch, and think about the Kafka story, Investigations of a Dog, which it is precisely because this pup has an experience of seeing these musician dogs he talks it. He loses all the happiness of all the innocence of childhood, and launches in this kind of lifelong obsession, almost like a Thomas Pritchard novel, The Crying Lot of 49, of trying to figure out what that means. And because he does that, he loses all of his he basically ends up miserable and crazy, and kind of he's not able to participate in the canine community of all the other dogs. Like he's kind of like an outsider forever. And so if the canine community is the animal, being an animal, he becomes animal-like because of the question, because of the thinking, and that participates in, like, he's at this one point where he's trying to do these like experiments to figure out how food comes from the sky, because and it's actually really kind of funny. It makes me think of David Hume, because animals always see food being handed to them by animals, so they conclude food comes from the sky. And so his entire scientific experiment is organized around figuring out how food comes from the sky, which of course it does not. But the scientific experiments cannot save him because it is organized according to his experience. And so it can't get him out.
It's that the empirical data just won't satisfy the what's actually happening.
Well, because empirical data always has to be arranged in a structure that itself is not empirical. Certain assumptions about different things. So the joke there is that science doesn't help the dog, really. And what's so interesting, but then at the end, because it's kind of funny, because this whole investigation of a dog is basically going, we all know as readers, oh, this is funny that a dog's trying to solve the mysteries of the universe, and that's of course impossible. But then when we do it,
but then when we do it,
you know,
I make a very similar point in an essay I just wrote on which I'll make a video of.
Great.
Borges, the Library of Babel.
Yes.
Yeah. Have you read that?
Yes.
I make that a very similar point you just made, where they're trying to look for this information. They have the fundamental law of the library, right? But that fundamental law of the library is based off of 0.00 however many 1% of knowledge of what that library contains. Yet they were able to create this whole system around that, when all it would take is one single book where they open it up and there's a letter they just never saw before. And then their whole fundamental law, but yet everyone accepts this as a truth, is this fundamental law that there's 26 characters, and they just accept that, even though they've looked at virtually no books at all. And so this idea that but again, you think of it and you go, well, that's ridiculous. No one would make laws based off that little knowledge. And yet here we are doing it every day.
I'm so glad you brought this up, because in the investigation of the dog says, if I could just find the fundamental principle, that's all I want. He's looking for a fundamental principle. But then, like, the very investigations, whatever fundamental principle he arose to could not possibly be the fundamental principle, but he would have to conclude it was, based on those sort of investigations. So there's kind of a joke that's running through all of this. And I'm glad you brought up Borges, because, I think it's the alpha, the ALEPH, alpha, where he talks about this point with all the infinite is composed in the infinite, this point that everyone's looking like, basically the ultimate truth. I love that story, because basically the dog is looking for that, like the alpha. And what's so funny in that story is the guy kind of falls down a staircase he's like talks about it, no one's ever seen it, and he falls down a staircase into a basement, he kind of glances under the step, and there it is. It's just like right there. All of these efforts to find the ultimate truth, to encounter God and whatever, it's like no humans can ever do it, and when you find it, it's just kind of by accident. It's kind of a joke in some respects. And so basically what you see in the investigation of a dog is the effort to find the alpha, as opposed to just stumbling upon it, leads to it's just kind of a joke, really. And also it just leads to torture. And in the same way that if we associate the law with the alpha in the trial, or we associate this state that the hunger artist is looking for, that is impossible, but is a kind of encounter with the alpha, where everyone knows absolute truth and knows that he's genuine and knows that what he's doing, the true art, almost a capital A, it's the very effort to find that leads to one structuring their life in such a way that one may make them miserable, or lead to their capture or susceptible. But then of course the question is, how can you not search for that? Once you are accused of a crime you are not guilty of, once you see this vision of dogs that are singing, once you are possessed by art to do this, how can you not search for that thing? How can you not do it?
And before that happens, you have to establish a fundamental law. Yes. No matter on how much information, because if you don't, then how do you know you're going to be looking for anything at all? So fundamental law, no matter how much little information you might have, you have to establish something.
Yes.
If not, then what's the point in looking? You might find it and just not know. And
that's exactly right.
And how this law might come out, and you see this all the time, is generally by just a consensus.
Yes.
It's just if the general consensus accepts it, then it might not be. It's truth. It is a truth as far as truth can be examined. Whether it's true or not is almost irrelevant. It is the standing truth until it can be justifiably proven otherwise.
Yes. Well, and that need for a fundamental principle by which to seek the quote unquote alpha, or we'll say the capital T truth, or whatever you want to put it at, which you have to seek once you have certain experiences. Like all these characters in Kafka, they just wake up as a bug. They didn't ask to have this experience of the dog singing, but once they do, they are compelled into certain actions that have to be according to a fundamental principle that itself cannot be substantiated beyond just kind of a consensus. So it's ultimately arbitrary. And yet, what else do you have? And so you're kind of hurled into what I like to call a conflict of mind situation, where you're very of epistemic epistemology, your very structure of understanding the world is precisely why you cannot understand the world. And yet, what else do you have? Like, what else are you supposed to do? And this is actually why someone like a Benjamin Fontaine or a Kierkegaard or whatever are quite important, because the only way to escape the structure is to escape your rationality structuring you according to a conflict of mind into a situation you cannot win is non-rationality. And I like to talk about non-rationality as opposed to irrationality, although though it necessarily is seen as irrationality at the time. Because in the same way, like in game theory, there's this idea of the Nash Equilibrium, where if everyone does what's rational, they end up in a suboptimal result. Basically, you can kind of look at a lot of Kafka as people doing what's rational and ending up in suboptimal results. But that would mean the only way to escape is to do what is non-rational, what is to act outside of the parameters of what constitutes the rational within that situation, which one, you're never going to think you need to know unless you know that, unless you know rationality has a certain limit, unless you know that the map isn't the territory. And then the question becomes, what exactly is the non-rational act you should do? Now, of course, Kafka, it's not so easy if you're Joseph K. and you've been put in this, maybe the non-rational thing is in fact to stay in your room. Maybe the non-rational thing is not to seek your own innocence. But a lot of times non-rationality is, if we're to be more existential and more general, and say a Fontaine or a Nicholas Bujayev and some of the Russians, is to act as opposed to think, to create and opposed to do what's rational, to sort of make alternatives as opposed to just doing what's right. And basically, and then I'll pass it back to you, all of this suggests too that the dream of the Enlightenment, the autonomous rationality, actually could lead to just Kafka-esque situation, conflicts of mind, or Nash equilibriums where you need something else. That's not to say rationality is bad, but that it has to be put in its proper bounds in a concert of variables of other things.
Perfect. Absolutely. And this goes once again right back to what we were saying at the beginning, where Kafka's just saying it as it is.
Yes.
And we don't know that. But reading Kafka, you're forced to try and understand what's going on. The metaphors I've used, even if there aren't any.
That's right.
And somehow, if say peer-reviewed paper is very well known in an interpretation of Kafka, and we all just accept it, that actually is what it's about. Even though Kafka just wrote it the way it is, he woke up a bug. That's what he means. But this thing we've all assumed what it meant by this one person that we deemed was in a position to tell us what this means. We all accept it. That actually is now truth. Very, very much. The death of the author.
Yes.
Barthes. Yes. The meaning interpretation starts at the reader. And that can be applied to what we're just talking about. The meaning of the fundamental law. It starts at the ones that that put it together.
Magnificent.
In many ways.
Well, magnificent. And a way I kind of I guess when I go through Kafka, I guess a way to sum it up is he examines how the desire of the human being to know and to be known contributes to their capture. We want to know ultimate truth. We want to know justice. We want people to know that we're a genuine artist. We want people to, we want our parents to know that they love us. We want to know that our father is proud of us, and the judgment are different things. And that contributes to the problem, where the desire to be known and to know contributes to the problem. But Am I saying that therefore we shouldn't try to know? Well, one, it's like not possible for the human being to do that. That's why I think in Kafka there is this kind of idea that the animal is almost the ideal, because the animal doesn't have to worry about this. They're free from freedom. They don't have to worry. They don't think about being known or no. They just do. You know, there's this kind of freedom from freedom in the instinct, but that's not an option for us as much as we may try. We can get really close, but we're not going to quite be it. To me, what Kafka shows is if indeed rationality is what can structure us into all these problems, then the questioning of rationality would be part of the solution. But what does that look like? For me, a lot of it is epistemic humility, like to say, well, maybe I don't know. Maybe that's not the case. Well, you just kind of pause and you sort of think about it for a minute, because it's almost certainty or the desire for certainty. Or to be certain that other people know who you are. It's almost like we can say the problem is the desire for certainty that leads you to all these problems, would tend to go together with rationality, because if you want certainty, then what's rational is to do X, Y, and Z, or so on and so forth. If you want to be certain that people know that you're not faking your fast, then you break the 40-day rule or something like that. And so rationality and certainty go together. But to me, Kafka shows that one of the ways we can avoid Deleuzian capture is in fact a kind of epistemic humility, or sort of like not being so sure of our own rationality and to question ourselves. And that's also how perhaps we can get a beneficial Derrida, where we escape these dichotomies of rational versus irrational that capture us. Because like you see it today, when everyone's so sure of themselves, right? You know, these liberals are destroying America, these Trumpers are destroying the country, these biotech companies, everyone's so certain that then when they're certain, all the liberals are out to destroy America, it becomes rational to form tribes of just conservatives or Trumpers, or vice versa, right? But that, of course, then leads to a system where the democracy is not unified, and when they're fragmented, they're easy to be controlled by the corporations of the state or different things like that. And so there's something about epistemic humility to me that contributes to escaping the Nash equilibriums per se that are described in Kafka.
Absolutely, and I think bringing up Derrida there is perfect. As he himself said, the deconstruction itself is always looking at the other. It's not a system that should be applied. It's something we naturally do by negation, even if we don't realize it. The only reason why we're realizing what we're realizing is because what we're not realizing is there. And so, but in deconstruction's purpose is to then turn that realization and see what we weren't realizing by realizing something else.
Yes.
And then that's to humble yourself and to realize there is always that other.
Yes.
And it always has to be in consideration. And you're not going to ever fully realize what you're realizing until you realize that, even though it's always going to be there.
Oh, yeah. And if your rationality is structuring your organization in the world that captures you, the only way to escape that is to believe in another that you can't fully see. That's kind of a faith thing, almost like trust. Like you really can't see the other if you're just following life according to your rationality, because they're operating within their rationality. We talk about putting our feet in other people's shoes, but often we just put our shoes in other people's shoes. We don't actually enter the world. But really what Derrida suggests, if we take all the game theory and the topic, the only way to escape ending up like a Joseph K is to really, really, really make space for the other, because that, by definition, is non-rational, because your rationality must be calibrated and conditioned by you and your ideas of what are true. But that is what captures you. That is what gets you into trouble. But the moment you take seriously the other and the fact that they are conditioned differently than you, that's a non-rational act, because it transcends your rational schema. And because you do that, you now don't have to end up like Joseph K. You now don't have to end up in a situation where you participate in your own capture because you're doing what's rational according to your autonomous truth. That doesn't make room for the other. So I think Kafka does actually lead us, if we take all this quite seriously, he points to the possibility of, dare I say, love as a possible solution to this, if it really is, though, an opening to the other. I had to get romantic. Yeah, I had to get
No,
romantic.
I never looked at thought of that. Yeah, you know, and I don't know how much you know of his personal life, but with you, he was someone that very, very much struggled with relationships,
Yes,
and
he did.
in that area. So then I'll have to go back and read it with that lens.
Yeah, well, I was about to
That's
say, because you know,
interesting.
he almost got married, then he didn't. He struggled with his
Yes.
dad. He did these letters. Mariah, I can't start with an
Felice.
M, I think. Melania.
There's Felice.
Yeah, he had a struggle love life.
I have all those.
But you see, often the people who are best at describing the problem are the ones who themselves don't know the solution. Because often when we know the solution, we just skip to the solution and we don't fully fledge out the problem. So I'm not saying that Kafka didn't know the solution, but there's something about Kafka. One of the reasons he's so genius and so perfect at describing and showing, mostly showing everything that we've said, is precisely because he himself may not have been able, tragically and ironically, to engage in the love that is needed to escape being a Joseph K. Which then we can view Kafka actually as sacrificing himself for us, because in him, like, not doing that, he was able to articulate the problem in a manner that then we can perhaps see it clearly to start seeing why the other is so important. Now, I'm not saying that Kafka didn't know the answer, but I think sometimes, like, even if the person didn't in their own writing have the answer, when they truly are a great artist and they're just trying to be honest and to really describe the world as it is, then that description can be so internally consistent that it can help us build and to see what could possibly be the way to escape ending up as a Joseph K, precisely because they did such a good job of sketching out the problem.
And within the metamorph, that could be applied perfectly with metamorphs too, especially with the idea of sacrifice. I mean, that was all Gregor Samsa was about, was just to sacrifice his whole entire being to his family. That's why he existed, or why he thought he existed. And so and it wasn't until his sister's playing the violin and
and he's attracted in, and then he gets thrown the apple on him or something like that.
Yeah, because the apple. So and what's funny is his father throws the apple, right, and one gets stuck in his back, and it remains there.
Yeah,
and it just never goes away, and it's kind of ends up becoming more and more kind of a burden on him, and what's funny is right at the end when Gregor's walking away for the last time after hearing his sister play the violin, he knows he's walking to close the door for the last time. His family knows that, and there's that quick pause, that stop that Gregor does, and he looks behind him to see if anyone's going to stop him. But then he turns back and goes back in. And you wonder if he turns around, does he look to stop because he doesn't want to die, or does he turn around almost as an apology, saying, "I can't take care of you anymore"?
Right.
Like, well, which is, because he is not concerned about himself throughout the whole thing. So it wouldn't make sense that he could now wants to someone to stop him from ending his own life. So maybe that stop wasn't for him. It was just I apologize. I can't take care of you. And that's why the whole ending is then just them working at a table trying to figure out, because it almost seems like the ending's out of place, but it's not. Not if you interpret that one pause in that way. Now that ending makes perfect sense.
Oh yeah. No, what you're saying is huge, because at the end of the trial, he's basically apologetic to the guards that he can't kill himself, that he can't do it. There's like an apology because he's internalized his guilt for a crime he could not have committed, and then he's like inconveniencing the guards by making them stab him. I think what you're saying, again, what's so interesting with Kafka is he is also aware how the ethic of sacrifice could be used to control people, or obligation like to his dad or the law clerk or the state or whatever. And then at the same time, though, sacrifice, there's something noble about sacrifice. But this is why I think philosophy suffers, frankly, from not taking literature seriously, because the literary writers tend to be very aware of how a good thing in the wrong way is a bad thing. But that doesn't mean that it's not the solution or does not have some truth to it. But often the writers are kind of prophetic in the sense that they glimpse something that they're trying to capture. And even if they don't fully understand it, they're trying to capture it. I'm not saying Kafka didn't understand, I'm just talking generally. Like until there's a prophet, usually the philosophers don't have anything to think about. Like the philosophers need the prophetic voice of someone who's declaring that there's a problem with rationality, and the philosopher's like, you idiot, rationality is great. Well, let me think about that. Hold on. Like there's a prophetic voice, and then like you would, Dostoevsky and Kafka have inspired an unbelievable amount of philosophers. But the kind of things that they saw could not be put in philosophy first. It had to be shown because it was too complex and integrated with the human experience. And then after the prophetic voice, the philosophers could go do the work. So Kafka here has seen how there's something about sacrifice that's important, but also seen how it can be used to manipulate. He's seen how rationality is inescapable, but then we can't be animals, so we can be animal-like, but we can't be animals. We have to be driven. So what do we do? What do we do? And that's where the thinking can begin. Often thinking begins with a novel. Thinking often begins with a novel.
The fundamental law of philosophy is literature or fiction.
Yes.
That's a...
Well, fiction is a description or an articulation of how a life could be. And if it is a possibility, then it is in essence a kind of thought experiment. And what do philosophers often do? Thought experiments. Good novels are always thought experiments. They're just really elaborate ones, and also can't just be reduced to a single principle or a single idea and don't always know, what they're about. And a really good novel is not just about one thing. It's about a complexity of variables that are coming together in a sort of dance that are not easily sorted together and are not reducible, that have to be taken as their emergent whole. And when then the philosopher will start to think about what that means exactly and what could be deduced from it but the philosopher, once they begin reducing the novel to a single principle or a single meaning, then it's no good. But a great novel is always possible, even if it's unbelievable. Even the reduction to a bug, even if you can't literally be reduced to a bug, it's very possible for someone who works a job to feel like a bug and to, in essence, practically be a bug. And it is absolutely possible to be convicted of a crime you're not guilty of. And it is absolutely possible to desire a state where you're free from freedom, like the Hunger Artist. All of these things are possible. And therefore, all of them are worthy of the philosopher to consider. But here's the funny thing. Usually the gift of the writer is to think of situations that the philosopher doesn't have that gift to think up. And so they desperately need the writer to think up those situations, to consider it. And for all of this is all to say, I always mention this, the separation of literature and philosophy has been utterly dire and terrible. Don't get me wrong. There could be a problem when you have a overly, a philosopher that doesn't make their arguments and just kind of throws out poetic lines or stuff like that. Or vice versa. You don't want a book that just kind of information dumps the entire time. But there is a dialectic there that is extremely necessary for deep thought. To actually have serious thought. And I'm afraid that by both of them seemingly making an enemy of one another, we've been in trouble.
Yeah, I fully agree, and it's almost that the philosophers almost would agree as well. And then it's like, even if they don't have the specific literature at hand, they often like I mentioned earlier, start not only uses these tiny little anecdotes to describe it, but even someone like Camus and the myth of Sisyphus. I mean, it all does in a way. Well, I mean, again, I might just be rewording what you're saying, but yeah, these ideas do come from, and even before they would have the written text to read it, then it comes from a story they heard by someone else that happened to another guy, that happened to another person, and they go, oh, this happened to a friend of mine, and then the philosopher goes, okay, well, let me think about that for a moment, which is just essentially the same thing.
Oh, I think I mentioned this before, but it's always funny to me, philosophers are like, we don't need story and images. We just need premises and symbolic logic. But it just happens to be that the most popular philosophical ideas are storied or parables, like philosophy. You mentioned the myth of Sisyphus, Plato's cave, Wittgenstein, the bunny rabbit, like they have an image, the bunny duck or whatever. There are images and there are things that then people, or the doorknob and being in nothingness that you mentioned, the keyhole where he looks for, these are the things that people like remember. And so, the truth of the matter is that, Hegel had this notion when he talked about, the abstraction, the negation, and the concrete. I mentioned this to Dr. Last. Any idea that cannot be storied, we should be skeptical of its ability to be made concrete and to be made actual. And for Hegel, an idea that cannot be made concrete is practically no idea at all. It doesn't even exist. Like if you can't make an idea concrete, if you can't negate the abstraction into concretion, it's basically not even an idea. Like your idea for how to start a business is not even an idea until you try to do it and find out how dumb you are about what you think business takes or writing or what on and so forth. In a very similar way, philosophical ideas that cannot be storied, we should be skeptical of their relevance. And yet we have this tendency to think the exact opposite. We tend to think that if a philosophical idea could be storied, because maybe it was our philosophy professors who taught us this or whatever, because they want their, their position to be the most important. We've been told that like storied philosophical ideas are problematic, when really, I think it's the opposite, because if it cannot be storied, then we should be skeptical of its ability to be made concrete. And if it cannot be made concrete, who's to say it's an idea at all?
And that goes perfectly in line with the video you put out that I saw this morning, in which an object we tend to look at its parts. Yes. Well, let's do the same thing with an idea, and this is very Hegelian. An idea is not really. It's not its parts. Well, every idea is a complete idea. Now there's parts, sure, but it's an unraveling absolute, right? So every could be looked at in the same way.
It's like the idea is it has to be completed to be itself.
Yes.
In the same way that an object is a concert of its parts, it can't be reduced to its parts. We talk about the whole versus the parts, but really we should talk about parts and wholes. Like we would never say that Beethoven's Ninth is just the musicians playing, right? We would say that Beethoven's Ninth is something greater than the musicians, but also the musicians are necessary for it. In the same way that we can start thinking about the relation between literature is the concert of philosophy. Writers have to have ideas in order to make a great story, but the point of the ideas is to come together into a bigger story. And then from that, we can start examining the part of the violin and the trumpet, like the different ideas. But the whole point of philosophy is ultimately to live it, right? And what do we live? Stories. We live lives that are more storied than just premises.
Absolutely. This is well. You could take to further point that out. You could take any story. You could read a sentence. A sentence makes perfect sense. And then you take that sentence. You go, well, that's a full, complete sentence. And then you take it and put it in the paragraph. You go, well, that paragraph makes perfect sense. And so you think, well, but still, that paragraph is still part of a large thing, and you're not going to get the full thing of that sentence until you've read the whole book. And you're almost forced, especially with reading Kafka, you're forced into this kind of hermeneutical circle in which you read a sentence, of course, which is often mentioned in the opening sentence of the Metamorphosis, is just the way it's structured. So one day it's a very normal sentence all the way until you get to the very end, and then there's that last. And then it transformed into an insight. And then you're forced to go read from the beginning and reread it, and you have a completely different meaning. Absolutely. Of what it was from the very first sentence. And you do that with the novel. Like you can read a sentence from any book and it makes perfect sense. You could read a paragraph, you could read it, and you could leave it at that. But it's not a complete book until it's complete.
Absolutely. No, that
story. Maybe I should say.
No, that is absolutely beautiful, and seeing that relationship between philosophy and literature as such, as a constantly reworking, where one is making the other complete in dialogue with one another, I think is very important. In the same way that Kafka has taught us. If we take as the principle of rationality capturing, rationality has to be in concert with non-rationality, and they have to be informing one another. Otherwise, we're going to end up captured and we're going to be incomplete. And in the very name of doing what we think is rational, end up like a dog, not a dog, but like a dog.
and it is, and even that though is still necessary to ever have any hope in achieving and recognizing the other.
Absolutely.
It always comes back to Hegel. You know, it's just this constant unraveling of what is.
Well, there's a really funny sense in which the very fact that our condition is as Kafka described it, that we are forced or must ultimately consider the other. You know, if autonomous rationality was possible, in a sense, a rationality that didn't have to worry about these Kafka-esque situations, but we wouldn't have to care about the other. So in a sense, there's a kind of grace in the fact that life is structured like of a Kafka story, precisely because that compels us to ultimately have to take the other seriously. And who would want to live in a world that didn't ultimately force us or find its solution in the taking seriously of the other? So that's all to say we're lucky to be in a Kafka novel.
This positive. I mean, do we have a choice?
Yeah. But, you know, we want to be free from freedom, right? So maybe it's good, you know, that the other A equals B or something of that nature. Well, Pae, I tragically must get ready for all of the things of the demands of the world. We jumped right in. I was so excited to speak with you. I was so thrilled to speak with you that right to it. I appreciate your time. I'd love to do this 1,000 times more. All the work you do on your channel is tremendous. I love your reviews. I love everything you do. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been just a complete treat.
Yes, thank you. This was it was as good as I thought it would be.
This was a delight. Thank you, Pae. I appreciate it.
Thank you.